I stood in the lobby of Vanguard Systems at 11:51 p.m. The security guard shook his head, tapping his clipboard. "I am sorry, ma'am, but the CEO's wife is already inside his office." I didn't gasp. I didn't demand to be let up. I just smiled, a cold, clinical stretching of my lips. "Of course," I said. "My mistake. Justin wasn't working late. He was living a second life." Have you ever suspected someone you loved was living a double life? Let me know your story down in the comments. I am reading every single one. I walked out of the glass double doors and the cold night air hit my face. I didn't cry. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. I drove 3 blocks to a 24-hour diner, ordered a black coffee, and opened my laptop. This wasn't a breakdown. It was a balance sheet. For years, I had been the silent investor in our version of a family. Justin was the brilliant CEO and I was the supportive foundation. I often ask myself why I tolerated his late nights, his dismissive tones, the constant feeling of being a secondary asset in his portfolio. Psychologists call it learned helplessness, the invisible chains of a survivor. When you are conditioned to believe your worth is tied to your endurance, you stop looking for the exit. You convince yourself that the neglect is just the cost of doing business with a successful man. I had convinced myself I was essential, but I was just an unpaid contractor maintaining a facade. Not anymore. I logged into our joint accounts. As a forensic accountant, numbers are my first language. They don't lie. They don't gaslight. They just reveal. I started pulling bank statements, credit card logs, and tax returns from the past 4 years. The betrayal wasn't just physical, it was financial. Within 20 minutes, I found the first discrepancy. A recurring transfer of $6,500 every month to an LLC registered under a name I didn't recognize. I traced the LLC's registration to a luxury apartment complex downtown. Justin wasn't just having an affair, he was subsidizing a shadow life with marital assets. Every expense, every dinner, every plane ticket was meticulously logged. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon regret, but there was only clarity. I was building a ledger of his deceit. By 2:30 in the morning, the picture was crystal clear. The CEO's wife the guard had mentioned was Megan, the vice president of operations. The shadow apartment was their sanctuary. I downloaded every receipt, every transfer confirmation, and every suspicious invoice. I saved them to an encrypted hard drive. I didn't feel devastated. I felt like an auditor who had just uncovered a massive discrepancy. The marriage was a void contract. The affection was a subscription, and I'd been footing the bill. I closed my laptop. The diner was empty, save for a tired waitress wiping down the counter. My husband thought he was a mastermind, a titan of industry who could manipulate the board and his wife simultaneously. He forgot that I was the one who taught him how to read a profit and loss statement. He forgot that I knew where every single penny was buried. I paid for my coffee, leaving a generous tip. The audit had only just begun, and the penalties for his fraud were going to be severe. I was sitting at the kitchen island when Justin walked through the door at 3:15 in the morning. He loosened his tie, rolling his shoulders in a performance of utter exhaustion. He looked at me, a practiced expression of weary affection settling onto his face. "I'm sorry, Elena," he said, pressing a kiss to the top of my head. "The board meeting dragged on forever. We have a massive merger on the horizon. I need to make sure every detail is perfect." I looked at him. There was no scent of perfume, no lipstick on his collar. He was too smart for those amateur mistakes. But I could see the slight flush in his cheeks, the relaxed set of his jaw. He was a man deeply satisfied with his double life. "You work too hard," I replied, my voice perfectly level. I poured him a glass of water. He sighed heavily, leaning against the marble counter. "It's the price of leadership," he murmured. "By the way, you seem a little distant lately. Are you feeling okay? You've been so withdrawn." I almost admired his audacity. It was classic deflection. Create a problem in the other person to mask your own guilt. He was attempting to gaslight me, to audit my emotional state before I could audit his actions. A year ago, I would have apologized. I would have analyzed my behavior, wondering if I was failing in my duties as a partner. Now, I saw the tactic for what it was, a cheap manipulation tactic from a man desperate to control the narrative. I am perfectly fine, I said, keeping my tone mild and unbothered, just focused on my own projects. He smiled, relieved that his deflection had seemingly worked. Good. I need you to be strong right now. The next few months are going to be critical for the company. He had no idea how true that statement was. As he walked upstairs to shower, I remained in the kitchen, the invisible architect of his impending ruin. He thought he was managing a difficult wife, placating me with corporate jargon and feigned exhaustion. He didn't realise I was simply absorbing his lies, cataloguing them, and filing them away as evidence. Every word he spoke was another line item in my case against him. He was building his own prison, and I was simply handing him the bricks. I listened to the water running in the master bathroom. My husband equated deceit with intelligence. He believed that because he could lie convincingly, he was untouchable. But lies require maintenance. They require a constant expenditure of energy to keep the structure from collapsing. The truth is much more efficient. The truth just is. I turned off the kitchen lights and followed him upstairs. I would play the role of the quiet, distant wife for a few more hours. I would let him sleep the deep, untroubled sleep of a man who thinks he has won the game. But the game hadn't even reached halftime, and the rules were about to change permanently. At 4:45 in the morning, the rhythmic sound of Justin's breathing confirmed he was asleep. I slipped out of bed, bypassing the creaking floorboard near the door, and walked down the hall to his home office. Justin was arrogant, but he was also meticulous. He kept physical backups of his most sensitive files in a biometric safe hidden behind a row of bound legal volumes. He was arrogant enough to believe that his own home was the safest place for his secrets, assuming I was too submissive and uninterested in his business to ever investigate. He thought the safe was impenetrable. He didn't know I had installed the security system and memorized the master override code 3 years ago. I hadn't used that override until now because I never wanted to believe he would reach this level of corruption. It was my failsafe, the ultimate insurance policy I had been keeping for a day I hoped would never come. I punched in the sequence. The heavy steel door clicked open. Inside were stacks of manila folders, external hard drives, and a black leather ledger. I pulled the ledger out first. My initial assumption was that I would find more details about Meghan, more receipts from their luxury shadow apartment, perhaps some expensive jewellery purchases. But as I flipped through the pages, the scope of his deception expanded exponentially. This wasn't just infidelity. This was a sophisticated corporate crime. The ledger detailed a series of shadow board meetings, unrecorded gatherings held at the exact address of the luxury apartment downtown. But Meghan wasn't the only one attending. The notes listed 3 key executives and 2 external contractors. They were using the shadow apartment to bypass Securities and Exchange Commission regulations, orchestrating a massive money laundering operation under the guise of offshore vendor payments. Vanguard Systems was bleeding capital, and Justin was funneling the funds through shell companies directly into private accounts. The $6,500 rent was just the operational overhead for a criminal syndicate. My husband wasn't just cheating on me. He was defrauding thousands of shareholders, his employees, and the federal government. The stakes had just escalated from a messy divorce to federal prison time. I connected his external drive to my laptop and initiated a mass transfer. Gigabytes of emails, encrypted memos, and falsified profit projections flooded into my secure server. I worked with methodical precision. There was no panic, no trembling hands. I was executing a data extraction. The numbers told a story of grotesque greed. Justin had built a shadow corporation within his own company, leveraging his authority to siphon millions of dollars. He used the affair with Meghan as a convenient cover, a smokescreen. If anyone noticed his frequent trips to the apartment, they would assume it was a standard executive indiscretion, not the headquarters of a major financial crime. He weaponized his own infidelity to hide his embezzlement. I took high-resolution photographs of the physical ledger, making sure every date, signature, and dollar amount was perfectly legible. Then I placed everything back into the safe exactly as I had found it. I closed the heavy steel door, listening to the locking mechanism engage. I sat in his leather chair for a moment, the blue light of the laptop illuminating the dark room. The betrayal of our marriage was a personal insult, but the fraud was a professional masterpiece. He had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. I shut down my laptop. The evidence was secured. It was time to introduce the true board of directors to their shadow counterparts. At 8:30 the next morning, Justin kissed my cheek, told me he had back-to-back meetings, and drove his imported sedan to the office. I waited exactly 12 minutes before leaving the house. I did not drive to Vanguard Systems. I drove to a private golf club in the suburbs where Richard Calloway, the chairman of the board, had a standing tea time every Thursday morning. Richard was a 68-year-old veteran of the corporate world, a man who valued integrity and profit margins in equal measure. He had always liked me, respecting my background in forensic accounting. I walked into the clubhouse dining room and found him sipping black coffee, reviewing a quarterly report. "Richard," I said, taking the seat across from him, "I need 20 minutes of your time." He looked up, surprised by my sudden appearance. "Elena, it is good to see you. Is everything all right with Justin?" "I didn't come to you with mere accusations, Richard. I've spent the last few hours compiling a forensic audit. It's a complete financial autopsy that maps out exactly how he's been bleeding this company dry. I hope you have the data to back it up." I tapped the cover of the dossier. Page 4 details the money laundering pipeline. Page 12 contains the unrecorded minutes of the shadow board meetings, including the signatures of the involved executives. Page 22 is a direct tracing of Vanguard Systems funds being deposited into private offshore accounts. Richard opened the folder. The silence in the dining room stretched for 10 agonizing minutes as he read. I watched his face transition from skepticism to shock, and finally to a cold, hard fury. As a former auditor, he knew exactly what he was looking at. The numbers were undeniable. My husband had compromised the entire corporation. "This apartment," Richard said, his voice dangerously low, "he is leasing it using company funds." "Yes," I replied. "It serves as the operations centre for the fraud and conveniently as a private residence for Justin and Megan, the vice president of operations, a 2-for-1 embezzlement scheme." Richard closed the folder. The colour had drained from his face, but his eyes were sharp. He pulled out his phone. He did not ask how I obtained the information. In the world of high finance, the source of the truth is less important than the liability it exposes. He dialed a number, locked down all network access for the CEO and the VP of operations immediately. "Get the legal team and the entire executive board on a secure line." He barked into the receiver. "Call an emergency session for noon today. Justin is not to be notified. Lock down all network access for the CEO and the VP of operations immediately." Richard hung up the phone and looked at me. You have just saved this company from a federal indictment, Elena." I nodded, standing up and smoothing my skirt. This was not revenge, it was accounting. I had balanced the ledger. Justin arrived home at exactly 4:15 that afternoon. His usual swagger was entirely gone. He looked frantic, his tie askew, his briefcase clutched tightly in his hand. He burst through the front door, shouting my name. He stopped dead in the foyer. Sitting in our living room was Richard Calloway, flanked by 2 senior corporate attorneys. Richard insisted on coming here himself. He wanted this handled quietly, away from the prying eyes of the media and the public, to protect the shareholders from immediate panic. I sat on the sofa opposite them, a cup of tea resting on my knee. The silence in the room was absolute. Justin looked from Richard to the lawyers, and finally to me. The colour rapidly drained from his face as the reality of the situation crashed down upon him. "Richard," Justin stammered, attempting to project a false authority. "What is the meaning of this? Why is my network access blocked?" Richard stood up, his expression carved from stone. "You are officially terminated as CEO of Vanguard Systems, effective immediately. The board has voted unanimously. We are turning over all evidence of your embezzlement, your shadow board operations, and your offshore accounts to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the federal authorities." Justin staggered backward, literally hitting the wall. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. "You," he whispered, "you did this." I took a slow sip of my tea. I merely submitted the audit, Justin. You provided the data. It is a psychological phenomenon, the illusion of power from an empty wallet. Men like Justin equate their self-worth entirely with their status, their title, and their bank accounts. They believe that power is an inherent trait rather than a conditional privilege. When they build their empires on deceit, they assume the wealth itself makes them invincible. But a status built on stolen money is just an empty wallet wrapped in expensive leather. The moment the capital is seized, the illusion shatters, leaving behind a hollow, terrified shell of a person. His power was a hallucination, sustained only by my silence and the board's ignorance. Now that the truth was exposed, his entire identity collapsed in seconds. Elena, please, he begged, abandoning all pretense of dignity. We can fix this. You are my wife. We can fight this together. I set my teacup down. The transaction is complete, Justin. Our marriage is dissolved, effective today. My lawyer will be in touch regarding the divorce settlement, though I suspect the federal government will be seizing most of your assets. You are no longer my husband. You are just a liability I have officially written off. The corporate attorneys handed him a thick stack of legal notices. Richard gave me a brief, respectful nod before turning to leave. We will see you in federal court, Justin, Richard said. The front door clicked shut, leaving Justin standing alone in the foyer, holding the papers that detailed his absolute ruin. He stared at the silence of the house, realizing that the supportive wife he had relied on to maintain his facade had been the one to meticulously dismantle it from the inside out. He wasn't shocked by what he had done. He was shocked that I had stopped playing along. I walked past him, heading toward the stairs to pack my things. The cold retaliation was complete. It took less than 12 hours to dismantle a fraud that had taken him years to build. Within 6 months, the federal indictments came down. Justin and Megan were both formally charged with multiple counts of wire fraud, embezzlement, money laundering, and conspiracy to bypass federal regulations. The trial was swift and clinical, entirely devoid of the dramatic courtroom theatrics Justin had probably anticipated. The documentation I had extracted from his hidden safe left his defense attorneys with absolutely no room for reasonable doubt. Justin was sentenced to 8 years in a federal penitentiary. The luxury shadow apartment was immediately seized by the authorities. His offshore accounts were permanently frozen, and he was ordered to pay millions of dollars in corporate restitution. Vanguard Systems survived the catastrophic scandal, stabilizing under Richard Callaway's steady interim leadership and a new, thoroughly vetted executive management team. I didn't stick around to watch the corporate rebuilding process. I finalized my divorce, took my financial settlement, my flawless professional reputation, and my peace of mind, and I opened my own independent forensic accounting firm. My primary specialty was corporate fraud detection and executive auditing. Within a year, I had more high-profile clients than my boutique agency could handle. Business leaders across the city knew I was the woman who had surgically dismantled a corrupt CEO and his shadow board in under 24 hours. It turned out to be an incredibly effective marketing strategy. I bought a beautiful modern loft overlooking the downtown skyline, decorated it exactly how I wanted, and filled the space with quiet, honest stability. There were no hidden shadow ledgers, no late night lies, no desperate attempts at gaslighting, just clean, perfectly balanced books. I've come to realize that betrayal doesn't have to define your fundamental self-worth. It is incredibly easy to internalize someone else's deliberate deceit, to mistakenly believe that you were somehow lacking as a partner, that if you had just been more attentive or more present, they wouldn't have lied. But their lies have absolutely nothing to do with your inherent value. Their lies are simply a reflection of their own morally bankrupt character. Letting go isn't always for the other person. Sometimes it's the only way to set yourself free. I didn't do this to absolve Justin of his crimes or offer him grace. I did it to detach myself from his wreckage so I could officially close the account and move forward without carrying the heavy debt of his deceit. I stopped being the silent, unappreciated investor in a fraudulent partnership and proudly became the sole proprietor of my own life. The glass barrier he had built to keep me in the dark had been thoroughly shattered, and stepping through the sharp shards had only made me infinitely stronger. If you found strength in Elena's story, share this video with someone who needs to hear that they are capable of starting over. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories of justice.